Hi friends, welcome to Keto Pictures. Let's discuss the mystery of apertures. Okay, apertures are so important to understand to, number one, get a good exposure, and number two, be able to tell your story through your pictures. There's two things you need to know about apertures. Number one, the aperture controls your focal plane, which means the amount of foreground or background blur that you have in your picture. So when I talk about focal plane, think of it as just a plane of focus. So depending on what aperture you have, you can have a very wide plane of focus, which means that this much all the way this way and all the way this way is in focus. And anything in front of that line is blurry and anything behind that line is blurry. Okay, so it controls your focal plane. And second, aperture controls how much light enters your camera through your lens. Okay, so when I say small aperture, that just means that the opening in the lens in your camera is very small, okay? And the number is very large. So if you had an f-stop or an aperture of 22, which is very, very small, the opening in your lens would just be teeny tiny, and you would have a lot of focus, okay? A huge focal plane. It'd be focused from here all the way to the mountains, kind of a thing. When you have a large aperture, that means that your number is very small. So you'd have, the number would be, say, 1.8. A large aperture, large is referring to the opening in your lens, and that means that you would have, your focal plane would be very small, okay? It could be, just a couple inches of focus, okay? So maybe you would focus on the baby's eyes, and so their eyes would be in focus, and then maybe their ears back would all be blurry, okay? So small aperture means less blur and means a very large plane of focus, okay? And also means a large number, so an f22 or an f11, okay? Large aperture, large referring to the opening in your camera, means that you have a lot of blur and a very narrow plane of focus. And the number would be very small. So you'd have a f-stop of 1.8. Okay? So let's take a look at these pictures. You can see Lyndon. This is at an aperture of 1.8, so f1.8. And you can see that he's in focus, but the trees and things behind him are very blurry. Okay? As opposed to this next one, which is an aperture of 11, so an f-stop of 11. And you can see that the trees are more in focus because that focal plane is getting wider. Okay, let's take a look at another one. So these flowers, the first one is we have an f-stop of 2.8, so that means your lens is open, very big, and it means that you have just a lot of blur. You don't have a very wide plane of focus. And then as opposed to an f-stop of 11, and you can see that now most of the flowers are in focus, whereas before just that middle flower was in focus and the rest was blurry. Okay? That's very important to understand because you want to get your person or your subject in that focus plane. So if you're using a very wide open aperture, a very low number of say 1.8 or 2.0, then you need to make sure that your focus gets right on so that that person is in that plane of focus and they're not out of it, causing them to be blurry. So right now let's see how aperture affects your shutter speed. Because remember, aperture is the opening of your lens, how big or how small it is. And the bigger the opening, the wider the opening in your lens, the more light that can flood in, which means that you can get a very fast shutter speed. And that's what I'm always shooting for. I'm always shooting for a very fast shutter speed because that's going to give you those real crisp pictures. So let's take a look. I've got my camera at an aperture of 1.4, and pointing it this way, my camera's telling me that I need a shutter speed of at least 1/400th of a second. So it says 400 on my camera, which is it's a really fast shutter speed. So that means my number's very low, my f-stop is very low, aperture, f-stop, same thing, and which means that my shutter speed can be very fast. All right, I'm going to increase my shutter speed, or my aperture, excuse me, as high as it will go. So I'm going to an f16, and right now my shutter speed has to be 1/5 of a second. So it's only at a 5 right now. It has to be open for 1/5 of a second to create the perfect exposure, which is very slow. If you have if you're taking a picture and it's on 1/5, you're going to get a very blurry picture. So let me go ahead and take a picture. So my aperture is at 16, and my shutter speed is at 1/5. You can hear how slow that is. I've learned to hold my hands really still when I have a slower shutter speed. But you'll be able to tell that it's not quite as sharp. And now I'm going to go all the way and take a picture at f1.6, and it's showing me that I have a shutter speed of 1/400th of a second, and you can hear how much faster that is. So on your cameras, look and mess around with the settings. See that when you increase your shutter speed, see that when you increase your aperture, making that number higher, your shutter speed is going to get slower. And see that when you make your aperture, the number lower, your shutter speed is going to get faster. And that's the only way you can do it, is just practice. See how, change your settings on your camera, take pictures, because you're going to get so familiar with those settings and what they're going to do to your picture. So I hope you make it a great day, and I will talk to you soon.